Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and the Full Scottish. I am Martyn Day. This is a review of the year and I'm joined with Hugh Marshall from Wales. Good to have you with us, Hugh. And I'm also joined by Alan Flowers. Alan is chair of the Anglo-Belarusian Society and is 30 years an expert on all things Ukraine. So we're really delighted to have you with us today, Alan.
Well, thank you for the compliment about all things. I think we toned that one down. Some things.
Well, we might as well bum ourselves up. It's that time of the year where we should all feel good. And I hope all our viewers are enjoying their festive celebrations as well. Our main subject, or we've got three subjects today, all to do with conflict. But our first one is Ukraine, which is a shockingly long conflict. And I think, unlike many of the other broadcasters, Broadcasting Scotland has tried to give people an unbiased view of what has been happening on a daily basis. Since the attack in February 2022, Russia has been relentless in its assault on Ukraine, but it's only been able to achieve marginal inroads into Ukrainian territory. I think we've got a lot to discuss, so rather than me saying what's happening, can we bring Alan? Would you like to come in and tell us what your thoughts are of where we are now and how we got there and what could happen next, which is, I could fill the whole show.
My thoughts in 2024 turned in March to the fact that it actually was the 10th anniversary of the action of Russia against Ukraine that started with what became known as these little green men, the surrogates that were non-uniformed but Russian operatives in eastern Ukraine. So I was very pleased to hear that you absolutely correctly referenced the date, 24th of February, as the date when there was a major Russian attack, because all that date was a massive escalation of the war that already was underway, with by then the process very well exercised by Russia, and before it the Soviet Union, of what we would term the frozen conflict. After capturing substantial swathes of eastern Ukraine and also taking Crimea, we have to remember that all mostly happened in 2014. And we're left wondering, well, what was the world doing for these 8 years, trying to parley with Mr. Putin and find some solution that never really came, but led to Mr. Putin feeling he could make the grab in 2022, or 2.5 years ago. And here we are with what I would consider as an academic who's been engaged in Ukraine for over 30 years. Primarily, my focus was actually Belarus, the co-belligerent. Mr. Putin, joined by his dictator friend, Mr. Lukashenko, who we won't graze with any other title because he is not recognized as a democratically elected head of state by any means, more like a self-appointed collective farm manager. So my thoughts are, we look like we finally are moving. Whereas 2024 has had its surprises, I would actually put right at the top of the list the Kursk offensive as being a very well kept secret by the Ukrainians, and a shock to the Russian people that their territory was not inviolate, and very sensible of Ukraine to have a grab that they could actually then trade territory for territory. The resilience of the Ukrainian people deserves our huge and enormous respect. And the fact that we're still here talking about it is a testimony to the resolve that they will continue until they get the form of victory that they're looking for. And I think a final third, if I was just to do a top three of what has been amazing points in 2024, Ukraine, even in Soviet times, was well known for its technological brilliance. The Antonov aircraft and were produced there. And in fact, early in the war, we saw one of the world's largest transport airliner smashed to pieces just outside Kiev. That was a Ukrainian product. They're settling for smaller things, the drones, and their technical expertise in warfare. And the way they are using drone warfare has come to the fore in 2024. And that has been an amazing highlight. Our armies throughout the world are learning lessons about how you conduct this new style of warfare. And in fact, I understand that in eastern Ukraine there was a major all drone offensive just yesterday, testifying the brilliance of the preparation and technology the Ukrainians have, which they're making themselves. So I'll leave you just to begin with my top three, and we'll leave you to continue in the direction you
Yeah,
wish.
well, thank you for that, Alan. I think we'll bring Hugh in just now, but we'll come back to you for what your thoughts are on the drone warfare, because I think this is a fairly new experience that most of us have now witnessed on our television screens because of the Ukraine conflict. But Hugh, can I bring yourself in at this stage?
Yeah, just talking about the drones, it was interesting that I learned last week that Ukraine are now trying to produce 1 million of their own drones, um, and again, I think they're ramping up sort of production, and this is why the Russians are attacking the energy infrastructure, because obviously if there's no power, then they can't be building drones. But it is interesting that the sort of, drones are almost like a game changer on the battlefield, because if you can send many drones at the same time towards the enemy, they can cause incredible amounts of damage. But we also know that the Russians are receiving drones from definitely from Iran, and I assume from North Korea as well. So it'll be interesting, and as we look back over the year, and it is remarkable that that Russia, are basically invading an independent country, and the world is still sort of scared to take on Putin fully, because we've seen this year, Ukraine, the Middle East, Gaza specifically, but also more recently, just before Christmas, Syria. And one of the reasons Syria fell to the rebels was because the Russians clearly couldn't stretch themselves that far. So, you know, it's interesting times in 2025 with the Trump administration coming in, who are seemingly going to be still supporting Ukraine. But I think Trump has made, the statements that it'll be over in 24 hours once he's president. So it'll be interesting to see how exactly he's going to do that.
Thanks, Hugh. Coming back to yourself, Alan, the the drone warfare is certainly of interest. How far technologically advanced do you think Ukraine is compared to the drones that Russia is deploying from these other
Way far.
axis of evil?
I'm an academic that was very pleased to be able to be engaged in the British Council's what was called Creative Spark program. This is one of many programs that Britain was doing before a war broke out. I mean, we in the UK had really first-class relations, possibly a leading country partner as regards Western countries. The British Council is rather famous for its English, but it also got involved in encouraging business startups. And I was very taken by the combination of engineering excellence, technological excellence that was going on in Western Ukraine in the period we were running this project from 2019 to 2022. And drones were in there, but they were intended for peaceful purposes like delivering medical packages or just business purposes, because there's a lot of distant, remote areas in Ukraine, particularly the southern area around the Carpathians, and just absolutely ideal for access. So they coming at this not from a standing start. Um, I mean, some of the great engineering schools in the world, it's just a little known corner of why Ukraine somehow sitting in the shadow of its big brother Russia, um, which um, for various reasons they might have some scientific excellence, but their ability to convert the engineering is in many ways really very clumsy. Um, I work with Lviv National Polytechnic. It would be rated as one of the top 3 universities in Ukraine, and it's got a world ranking as well. They have a fantastic engineering department there, and it's Lviv. We need to learn and see is a bit like for the UK, the Cambridge, or even what goes on around Glasgow, the science parks there, Glasgow University's links. So they were way ahead before the war started, and they've now reoriented. I mean, I've got friends in Lviv, very sad to see that they spend their engineering skills time absolutely focused on war effort instead of what could have been peaceful entrepreneurial purposes, but they'll switch pretty rapidly back. So, answer to your question, they are way ahead. They were way ahead at the start of the war, and they're even further ahead now.
No,
And that's why they've got such a range. And by the way, we shouldn't think of drones just as these little things that we buy in toy shops and they whiz around. The Ukrainians use hundreds, if not thousands, of these. So they're very useful for spotting and dropping little bomblets if you get a large enough one. But remember, drones are also these quite substantial, almost V1, if anyone remembers the wartime flying bombs with wings. Contemporary 2024 drones look a bit like that as well. The only thing is they're vastly superiorly controlled compared to the Second World War ones, and they can pack a punch and do a lot of damage. So it's unmanned aerial vehicles, and they come in all sizes and shapes. And the Ukrainians they've got good production capability as well. As long as they can get the materials, they will. And the electricity, there is quite a substantial distributed electricity supply. These attacks, they really just cause most inconvenience to the civilian population. Ukraine will keep its industry going in its production till the last uh, kilowatt hour is available. That's for sure.
Oh, thank you for that, Hugh. And of course, the big change coming is possibly is the Trump inauguration in January. How do you feel that will change the dynamics in the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, every time I hear about this 24 hours, I think about Genesis, the New Testament, and God created the world in 7 days. Yes, Trump will end the war in one day. Well, let's view it as a biblical one day at that level. I think everybody knows his team behind him must be wincing. That's rhetoric, and all things open. I mean, logically, there's only 4 ways that we're going to end this. It's so simple to enunciate; anybody can do it. Clearly, it's going to be Ukraine wins, in which case they will get Russia somehow out. There'll be a negotiation, or Russia ends up with a puppet in Kiev taking over the land. Now, these are extremes. What Russia rather likes is the frozen conflict, and it may well be that's the one we get, which means there's some kind of peacekeeping force along the line. And okay, the war, the fighting, and the shooting and the killing stops, but Russia is sitting there in a territory not recognized as Russian, managing a piece of what is internationally recognized as Ukraine. Now, there's this stuff all going on all over the borders of former Soviet Union. We've got the Nagorno-Karabakh problem that blew up last year. Transnistria is getting a bit noisy, and that's another example of these frozen conflict locations. Georgia has got a creeping frozen conflict. Let's not forget about that. That's been going on for 16 years since the 2008 invasion, and before. It was a messy result of the Soviet Union collapse in 1991. There's been patches that are Georgia would consider Russian occupied. So we might end up in that frozen conflict, or there won't be a cessation of the fighting and they'll slug it out until one or other just has to give up. The attrition is proving too much, which at the present moment, the resources and the problems Russia is having, I'm not convinced Putin would want a long war. You know, he's got every interest in probably going for the frozen conflict. And my guess is that's why Trump maybe thinks something quick can be done, because an agreement that just ends up with everything standing still and you tell everyone in 24 hours you stop shooting, you know, that technically can be done, but that would not mean a peace settlement and an end necessarily of this current 10-year plus old war. And let's not forget, March 2014 is when it really started.
So just summarising there, the risk seems to be that we could be in the situation that Putin's left holding territory that he's illegally occupying in a foreseeable period of time. Yeah. So can I bring yourself in, Hugh?
Yeah, it's difficult to add to what's just been said, but you know it is clear that Putin, I think, is overstretching himself. The fact that he has to, you know, not rely on North Korea for weapons, but now relying on North Korea for fight, you know, people to actually fight the war. It's difficult to know what people within Russia think and actually know about what's going on. You know, we hear conflicting reports of people being unaware and others, you know, being supportive of what Russia are doing. But you know, when it all depends on how it's being framed to them, I suppose. But I think, you know, the longer this goes on, and the longer Ukraine gets backing from the West, then you know Putin's hand is going to be forced sooner rather than later. Because I think in mid-December, the Russian central bank announced that inflation was sort of remaining at around 22%. So, you know, you can see that people in Russia are being impacted by, you know, the cost of goods and food. And as we've seen in, you know, in Wales and Scotland and England, you know, when it starts impacting you in the shopping basket, then, you know, people do start questioning what's going on there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hugh. Alan, do you think the sanction regime's making a difference, or is it too easily bypassed?
Well, it is making a difference, but it depends what sort of difference you're referring to there. It's caused both Belarus and Russia to reorient where their trading is. And in this respect, India's been a bit of a bit more because sales and China, that previously might have gone to the West, are sanctioned, are not sanctioned in these two major countries. So it's caused a complex reorientation of the business life and trading. And not the least, it's caused difficulties for China that saw routes through Russia and Belarus to the West. It's rather messed up arrangements for their trading, and that's one of the reasons China would probably have kept a bit on the sidelines of this, and if anything, is looking for an end to this as well. And I'm sure the American foreign affairs specialists will be all too aware that somebody who can whisper in Mr. Putin's ear about let's get this wrapped up is going to be coming from the East as well. So he's going to be caught in a bit of a pincer movement. Now, I mean, on the terms of the sanctions one, I'm more for Belarus in this, and there's now virtually no trade going with the West, certainly with the UK. I watched the UK figures. By the way, what there is going with there is smuggled. It's non-official, unofficial cigarettes and alcohol coming into the UK. But it's the reorientation. It's all very well Europe, essentially closing the borders to Russian and Belarusian trade. but they've just simply realigned. So, in that respect, the economic issue is not so much the impact on sanctions, which is obviously causing difficulties, particularly in the aspects of the banking sector for their international financial transfers. But really, the other one that's giving the pain is just the sheer cost of this. And it's not surprising this 20% inflation is running on. There must be a lot of money printing going on in Russia at the moment.
Well, thank you for that, which I think takes us on to our next item. We're also looking at the Israel-Gaza saga, which misery just seems to be spreading around the world over. And it's very hard to escape the conclusion that Israel's planning a future without Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. So what is the future? Is a two-state solution still viable? Are we looking at the possibility of a unitary state or an apartheid state, or just how do we get out of the mess that is there now? Is there a way out? Would you like to start us off on this item?
Yeah, I think it is an apartheid state. It's clearly that's what happened after the actions of Hamas over a year ago. Unfortunately, it did give Netanyahu the excuse he was looking for to basically try and wipe out the Palestinians, not just as sort of Hamas as a political and sort of terrorist organization, but clearly targeting the people, because we've seen the tens of thousands of women and children who've died, and we see the sort of incursions into southern Lebanon, and into Syria as well. So the worrying thing is that the world seems to be just sort of ignoring. He's been given red lines on a continual basis, and he's just ignoring it. He clearly feels that he's got the power to do what he wants. Trump has said that he will back him 100%. So it doesn't look very very good. But I think the key here is what's happening in Syria. But it's the other countries in the Middle East, that have a great deal of power here, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. Obviously, we've got instability still in Iraq. We don't know what's going to be happening in Syria. Hopefully, that will sort of fare better than what happened with Libya and Iraq when the West tried to intervene. Iran is obviously still sort of a pariah state, part of the triumvirate with Russia and North Korea. It's interesting. I think the issue is that we're all waiting to see what Trump does or what Trump doesn't do. And I think the next 4 years, it's just so important that that we try and get some sense back into the world. And I think from the world of politics, we've been discussing the veer to the right. But remember that the younger generation are more sort of left leaning and liberal, and hopefully we can sort of encourage a new generation now, because I do have a feeling as well that there's an older generation, sort of 60, 70 plus, who is clinging on to old ideologies, and they're trying their best to get their sort of powers out over the next coming few years. So I think hopefully there'll be a transition with younger politicians coming in and being able to stand up to these authoritative states like Russia, Israel, North Korea, Iran, and try and bring a bit of sense into the world. But it's complicated. It's so complicated.
No, it certainly is, and of course it's not just the politicians here, but it's also we've seen demonstrations in Israel as well. So there is hope that maybe another generation comes through. But in the meantime, we have the mess we have. Alan, can I bring yourself in?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking back to the whole length of process that's gone on with this. I mean, as a academic, I had students who lived in the West Bank, and I remember them telling me how difficult it was even 20 years ago. The complexities of life for the Palestinian in the West Bank, where they couldn't travel and easily cross into Israel and travel from Tel Aviv. They had some roundabout route they had to do. It's just there's absolutely no doubt about it. Grievance in Palestine has grown up over many decades, just as a result of, well, exactly this word, apartheid, which I gather has been used by various international organizations, Human Rights Watch, producing reports. So this word apartheid is in the parlance. The issues about the extent to which the International Criminal Court of Justice has called out Israel's actions. But how do you deal with a situation where two people are claiming the same piece of land and saying that Israel has its rights over the territories, and we've got to include West Bank as well as Gaza and slightly different areas. It was a long time ago since I was in Israel. It was actually in the 1980s, and I remember going up onto the Golan Heights and traveling through the West Bank at one point. And I found that a more settled and peaceful area than even Gaza in those days, which I was told by my Israeli friends they rather would not drive into. So the Gaza, in many ways, has been a more problematic and troublesome and dangerous hotbed. Israel's known that, and as Hugh rightly points out, the disappointment of this in this generation of politicians not to realise that two adults fighting over the one uh, the one cake and not wanting to divide it is just bizarre, and ending up having a massive attritional, hugely costly warfare over this. I mean, okay, the Israelis can point out their atrocities back in October 2023 that were committed. Yes, there was an invasion into their territory, but there's absolutely no comparison between that and the way that Russia behaved with Ukraine. And if this is one eye for one eye, it does seem like the count has rather massively gone wrong in some way, and there isn't really any balance in the level of attrition that's and damage and response that's taken place. I mean, this is just an absolutely massive, overwhelming response that's been exercised. So where the brains of the peacekeepers are in this, goodness knows, and it makes you wonder how one keeps the world in order in the not just the short term but the longer term, because the last few years have shown a horrendous and very disappointing breakdown of the world order, basically because there isn't any effective world policing force. The United Nations can make what resolutions it's like, get the reports out, Human Rights Watch and International Criminal Court, but who's got the force and will that will make sure that once a decision is made, it's actually enforced? It's quite clear Netanyahu feels, and having got the political support of America, absolutely inviolate. He will do what he wants. And in that respect, Netanyahu and Putin have great similarities in the way they're behaving. So, whilst one would wish to take a balanced view and hope that both sides can act, that I think in the current situation we've seen does become somewhat difficult. And where this one ends, again, there's going to be some big arm twisting, and maybe the change in the world order will come through the change the Americans have decided on, dubious though many of us are for it. The only thing we can say is it really does, and I agree with you, it needs absolutely new thinking and a completely different attitude to conflict settlement we've failed with.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Reflecting when you mentioned it had been the 1980s since you'd last been over that way. I was across in 2016 in the West Bank side and thought it was one of the most depressing visits I'd been on, and I struggled to see how a two-state solution was going to be viable without a willingness to exchange land just for a practical viability. That issue remains, as does how do you then restore the damage and address all the health implications that are going to follow from the conflict that's taken place. Hugh, can I bring yourself in again?
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's just so difficult to pick up what Andrew was saying is how do we affect change? Because we talk about democracy and being able to change things at the ballot box. We saw in America with Trump winning the election there, very very close. Even though Trump, again classically comes out and lies and says, sort of biggest win ever, biggest numbers. The fact is, it was close. But again, I think it's the circumstances. What happened in Ukraine has had a ripple effect across the world economically. And I think again, unfortunately, one industry that's doing well at the moment globally is the arms trade, and that's one thing where sort of governments have power, is the supplying of arms to Israel, and that would have an impact. I was looking up the other day, how much arms do sort of the UK supply to Israel, and it is actually very, very small. I think it's the United States and Germany who are the biggest providers of arms. But the thing what I don't understand is, after the atrocities, what happened during the Second World War, with the Nazis literally trying to exterminate Jewish people, trying to eradicate them off the face of planet Earth. How the people that was done to are now doing the same to another group of people, and that I just can't. I don't understand how you can have that lived experience and behave in that way. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The tragedy of history, that if we don't learn from it, we repeat it, and we're witnessing that unfolding.
Yeah, and I think it is getting worse. We've seen before Christmas, the horrible sort of tragedy in Magdeburg in Germany, with people losing their lives, at the Christmas fair. But you had, Elon Musk coming in saying, that the AFD are going to, sort of sort it all out. And it turns out that, the perpetrator, it would appear, was sort of more on the side of the AFD than on any of the other political parties. But the fact that people like Musk are trying to gain capital from this, and it's disturbing to hear, that Musk has been having conversations with Netanyahu, and it's, Musk is like becoming this de facto world president. And I think that's going to be the most interesting thing. I can't see Trump putting up with, playing second fiddle to anybody. And the fallout between him and Musk is going to be one of the most spectacular things in history.
Yeah. Well, we will watch that one, and no doubt it will appear on all of our social media feeds, whether we want to see it or not. It brings me on to our final conflict roundup of the year, being what's happening in Syria. Hopefully, we've got a wee bit more optimism, because there's been some change, although we've still to see the direction of that change. But the rule of the Assad family has came to an end after 50 years of oppression of its own citizens. And I am renowned for my mispronunciation, so I'm going to try this one. the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which I can definitely pronounce, which has swept to power in under a week. And we're potentially looking at a political realignment with major global significance now. Alan, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on this one?
My, my thoughts, like many whose eyes, obviously my expertise lies with Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and of course we got so much of Gaza and Lebanon. It was Lebanon was the most recent one. Was basically where on earth did this come from? Because these things, they don't just happen overnight. That was in the preparation. We got the financing, the arms. It was going on, and I don't know. We were just let down by our media, but I cannot believe our American and British, European security forces, intelligence forces, didn't have some idea that something was happening, and in fact, they quite probably did and let it happen. I think there's going to be a story to unravel on that because I mean I'm going back. The last big shock I got was I remember I'm going back now some 21 years when there was the Georgian Revolution, and suddenly on our BBC one Saturday we got masses of Ukrainians masses of Georgians, we're in Georgia to BC, storming a government building. And it was only later we realized this had been going on for weeks. It had never been reported. So it seems like there was a few things here in Syria, the build up and the early stages, it was just completely off the news horizon. And then suddenly we're hearing when a big city was taken, and obviously a few things been going on before then, we get it in the news. And then there was a great rapidity and a complete give up and a message from Russia, we don't have the resource. We can't support you this time round like they did in earlier years. I think it was back in 2016, the last week. And well, of course, the other thing that is a big dimension on the Mediterranean, uh, that's Russia's toehold for naval bases on the Mediterranean. And it wouldn't surprise me that there's Western interest clearly in seeing these nicely evaporate. Although, as my understanding at the present moment is nothing yet sorted or happening there. I can't say I've been following the news exactly as to what's happening on these bases, but there's that is a very the Syrian one in terms of the news in 2024. Dramatic, a huge surprise for all of us, and basically still catching up with the consequences. What sort of a
Yeah.
state this is going to be? And by the way, we've got to remember when I was visiting there in 1996, I was actually with a French archaeologist who had been born in Damascus, and the French were big in Syria, and I would imagine they are going to be having quite an interest, be latent interest, and France will not. They never do tend to give up their colonial areas. It's well known. The British walked out. We took our administrators with us, and the British Empire fell into chaos when we left. The French had a bit of a different view on that. They may have taken their politics away, but they left their administrators behind, and things kept ticking along. It was in everybody's interest to do so. Well, maybe not so much quite in Syria because there's been a lot more years pass, but very significant French interest there, which I think will be. There's a lot going on in the background we are not getting reported, is the basic theme of my comments on Syria, which makes it a very difficult one to catch up on.
Yeah. Well, before I bring you back in, I mean, obviously the change, I suppose, is that Russia and Iran didn't provide as much support as they might have been expected to
Yes, absolutely.
Syria. So what impact does that have, say, on the Ukraine scenario? Does that mean they've got a weakening of resources, or does it mean they're prioritising resources elsewhere
Well, I mean,
in the
the
world?
signals are flashing red all over the place. I mean, we don't need Syria to collapse to see that Putin is having difficulty working out how deep he will go down into his human resources in Russia. I mean, he's been very careful to avoid any significant recruitment in the big cities in Moscow. I mean, this is largely impacting on the huge rural resources. So yes, I mean the very fact that North Korea got wheeled in was already indicative they're having a problem, and that is very interesting. That the extent of the balance is so even now, and it is self-evidently even. There's not really a lot of movement in the front in the lines. That Putin clearly felt he could be significantly at risk if he removed the Air Force resources that would have been required to deal with the Syria conflict. So there's been a very, very clear that's a strategic decision, not even of a tactical level, because that is a major, major decision to decide you let Syria go to keep in the game in Ukraine.
Thank you for that. Hugh, can I bring yourself in on the Syria situation?
Yeah, and I think just we're saying there about the Putin, and I don't think it's just Putin either. It's Iran. The fact that Iran and Russia were the two sort of main sponsors of Syria. But again, it's the fact that Iran are supplying Russia with arms. Russia obviously had sort of military sort of facilities in Syria, and I assume the Iranians as well. But it's interesting as well about where Syria sits, because as obviously it's got Turkey to the north, and the tensions there with the Kurds, who were backed by the United States, the Kurdish rebels in Syria. You've got Lebanon to one side, which is surrounded by Syria. Saudi Arabia is only separated from Syria by a chunk of Jordan that extends towards Iraq, and then obviously Iraq is the largest border to the east. So there's lots of different political players there. I think the main thing that we've seen from what's happened in Syria so far is the fact that the West hasn't sort of intervened at the level that they did in Libya and Iraq. I think lessons have been learned about trying to impose Western ideas and ideologies in the Middle East. So hopefully that will change. Obviously the rebel forces, as while we welcome Assad being forced out of the country, that we remember that a lot of these rebels were born from ISIS and extreme ideologies. So again, it'll be interesting to see, but it does seem to be that the new regime is playing a sensible game and sort of being open to sort of cooperation. I understand that the Russians are still there and they're being tolerated, but they're not sort of going after the Russians. So obviously, some agreement has been reached at some level there to allow the Russians to withdraw. How long the Russians will keep a presence in Syria remains to be seen. But clearly, it's not going to be a force that it once was.
Oh, thank you for that. And I mean, I think that's, we look back at history and we think Iran had its revolution when they toppled the Shah, and then it was hijacked by the Ayatollahs. So you just don't know what comes next when these things occur, and they can move rapidly, as the as the media has shown us in the last week or two.
Yeah.
We've covered a fair bit. I mean, I suppose there's still a few other questions. I mean, we could talk all day, I suspect, on all of these issues. But I mean, what implication does the Syria situation have with Israel? Does it hold on to the Golan Heights, or what comes next? Anyone have a thought? Hugh, do you have
Israel have one of the first things they did was sort of incur into Syria. Obviously, with a view of saying, that it was, in self-defense, it was trying to sort of their own interests. But I think what will be interesting is I don't see the Syrian leadership putting up with, Israel doing what they want to do. And I think there's a different dimension here. I think the new Syrian regime will be getting support from lots of different sides, and that's going to make things harder for Netanyahu. So hopefully it could have a positive effect. But when it comes to Netanyahu, who can tell?
Indeed. Alan, can I give you the last word on this subject?
Well, I'd agree. I mean, it's a very complex matrix, the whole Middle East situation, but I think he's very well summed up the geopolitical importance of the Syria location. It always has been. And I just reiterate back to the fact that in the period after the Ottoman Empire collapse, post First World War, we're living to a large extent with the consequences of what was put in place by the French mandate in Syria and the British mandate in Palestine. I mean, what a failure, and we both were when we then came out after the Second World War and redrew the control with leaders of various forms, which were not entirely to the liking of the peoples. It's a sad reflection in 2024. We're dealing with the consequences of Western acquisitiveness of the Middle East and an inability to leave the Middle East alone to sort its own issues and be led by its own people. It's a culture very different from Eastern cultures and Western cultures, and where the world's paying a price for this in certain ways of perhaps having imposed far too much, particularly on the Arabic people. So it's no doubt when that happens, extremism arises, and it almost would be against the previous history there if Syria did settle down to be some form of an Arabic democracy. That type of government does not sit well with the Arab people. So it's a question of watching this space. A lot will be said early on, like we had in Afghanistan, as to how benign the regime was going to be, and one hopes there's enough force there. But it's no surprise that Netanyahu got very worried about what would happen to the weapons, who would get control, because that was material that they quite largely had to feel it was better to be destroyed in Syria than to have the potential to be used against Israel. And who was to know what arming might happen? The one thing that's very clear is the Arabic peoples have money, the oil money. That's still a big deciding factor that is paying. We need to think about who's paying for all this. War is a totally unproductive process. You're paying for human beings being fed to kill each other. Where's the resource coming from? They're not generating the food. Using very complex, expensive armaments. Also, all has to be paid for. So it's a little bit about time we began to work with and call out the paymasters. That's my closing thought. There are paymasters everywhere keeping these conflicts going.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point probably for us to end this item on. So thank you very much for that, Alan, and also thank you, Hugh. We will watch through the coming year for what comes next in all of these conflicts. Hopefully we see resolution, positiveness. I have to say, based on what we've seen in the previous year, I'm maybe a little pessimistic as to what we see, but we will definitely see something, and hopefully we see a reduction in the scale of killing and slaughter that has happened, and we get a better world as a result. But time will tell, and we will be discussing these issues again over the coming months, I'm sure, and I look forward to meeting you both again on those occasions. So before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach 36,000 by the end of the year. It is now December and we have raised almost 20,000, just half of our target. However, to pay the bills and survive, we urgently need to raise at least 12,000. We have borrowed 12,000 to enable us to survive for now, but the pressure is still on, and we do need to find enough regular donors to give us the financial security. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We are at crisis point and really need to increase our donations to be able to pay our bills and survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you. Thank you again to our guests. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Hugh. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.